This is Motovation. I'm Laurie Joy Kingwell.
And I'm Krissy Vann. We're two dreamers on two wheels inspired by our community.
And celebrating the voices we're just lucky enough to discover along the ride. So if not already, like, subscribe, follow along, do what you gotta do to not miss an episode.
Imagine riding a motorcycle down this windy road. The sun is shining brightly overhead. It's been an amazing ride so far, just like you imagined it to be. Because you left early before traffic. You checked the weather and it looked like bluebird skies. But then clouds quickly start rolling in. Rain is on its way. And the roads, they weren't what you expected. They're patchier, rougher. And suddenly you start bracing into the turns a little bit more, getting chilly. You maybe didn't dress the way you should have for this ride. And suddenly traffic seems to be piling up in a way that you didn't expect for this early in the morning. Suddenly this ride isn't aligning with what you thought it was going to be, what you expected it to be. Does it make it a great ride, a good ride, one that you would take again? See, we have these stories that we tell ourselves. And just like we have expectations about the weather, the conditions of the roads and the traffic ahead, we carry narratives about ourselves, others, and the world around us. And these narratives, they act as filters through which we perceive and create our own realities. And then they shape all the rest of the experiences along the way. Have you ever stopped to really consider the narrative that you've constructed about yourself, others, and the world around you? We each carry our own unique story, and it's mashed together from our experiences, beliefs, and perceptions. And this narrative, it becomes the lens through which we interpret and we interact with the world. And again, it shapes our reality. So join us today as we talk and unravel and explore how the story we tell ourselves influences our perceptions, behaviors, and ultimately our lives. How this understanding has profoundly changed our own lives. Because one shift can change your whole experience of your ride. This is your motivation. This morning, I want to get this topic not right, because you can't get it's not about getting it right. But I do want us to have kind of as much clarity as possible. And when I say clarity, it's usually me, because you always speak very clear and concise. So I was like, don't worry. But it's me. It's like and why I say I want to get this as clear as possible is because this has been one of the biggest pivots in my life, this concept. I don't even know if you call it concept, this understanding. And it continues to be, like, up until just even as of this last week. And when I say that, it is the story we tell ourselves. This conscious and subconscious ideas that we have about ourselves and other people and the world, all of our programming, conditioning, all these things. But the story that we have created, that we kind of live by, that creates our personal realities. And how fluid it really is, and how much we can be really empowered by it. And it can also be the thing that imprisons us. And most of us are kind of walking around in this imprisonment of it. And I'm going to kind of really start off with this quote or line, if you will, by Jason Proll. And he said, perception is projection. We don't see the world as it is. We see it through our life's conditioning and experiences. And why I find this so profound is because it really is true. We have this idea that what we're experiencing and how we're processing and the meaning we're giving it to it, all our daily experiences and our big life experiences and our memories from childhood and all those different things, we think they are fully real, full reality, and we forget that it's this personalized reality. And why this matters so much is because day in and day out, we give so much of our power away, so much of our energy away,
because the story that we're telling about ourselves, others in the world around us, and we think it's true and it's really not. And we've decided that, that guy's the bad guy or the rude one or the disrespectful one or the this or the that. And there is truth to it, right? Like you could break down, he turned around and called me an asshole, and I didn't do anything. I just parked my car and he just, whatever it is that there is some truth within it. But it's that story that I tell myself. I could sit there, and if I've already told myself that I am an asshole, I'd be like, oh, I must have done something wrong. I must have, he must have had his signal light on and I have done something wrong. And now I need to go apologize because, right. And my outcome is going to be because of the story I tell myself. If I also tell myself that everyone else is an asshole and that guy came and said, you're an asshole, I'd be like, fuck you, man. You're the fucking asshole. And there's just one more asshole out there being assholes. Or if I have a more compassionate storyline about myself and people around me, I'm going to be like, man, what happened to him that day? Something must be really rocking in his world, that something that really I didn't even know happened, or something really small that did happen has set him off in a way that I'm a complete stranger, that he's going to come up in an aggressive way. And suddenly, essentially, it's like whatever storylines that were given to ourselves that we've already decided, that is what we're going to project onto the world. And that's going to create the experiences and the meaning that we give it. And I really walked around for a lot of my life, even though I was giving the most generous version in many ways to people, anything that really didn't go my way, I really was having a projection and perception of it was everybody but me. And or if there was anything that I tried and it didn't work out, because I also had, a deficit in lens around myself, it was like, well, why even bother? You knew that wasn't going to work out because you're lacking this skill, or you're not good enough, or you're not smart enough, or whatever it always was. But all of a sudden my experiences, and I would just find myself in the same damn experience because that's what I was also projecting. So I was looking for it, even though I didn't know I was looking for it. It's like buying the red car. You see the red car everywhere. And I've gotten substantially more skilled at training my brain and training the behavior to be like, let's just pause and let's like take a look at what you're perceiving. And is that actually working for you? At one time, it might have been the thing that kept me safe as a kid. I was deciding to like watch out for the threats in people because it could be a real threat. And it had proved in evidence that like physically, certain things were threats. But now if I'm perceiving threats as an adult in my life everywhere, is it maladaptive? Is it working against me? And so it's all these different experiences that it's so empowering because you're like, what story am I telling myself? And if I can change the story and do the uncomfortable work of retraining myself to see it differently, I can have a different life. I can have a completely different story. But it's also super difficult because then it's full accountability. And accountability means change. And also the like uncomfortable feelings of being like, this was a choice. This was the meaning I gave certain things. And so the story we tell ourselves is exceptionally empowering, but it's also the craziest fucking hardest thing in the entire world because, like I said, the conditioning and the programming that led us here, that got us here to see the world as it is, like the neural pathways we talk about, it's so grooved into us. And we get these also, just a little like side note, and I want to get your thoughts then on this, is like, we actually get hits of feel good feelings when we adapt our story, when we're like, oh, that happened because of that person, because we are story making machines and we are trying to make sense of things. And so if something's hurt our feelings or something's been uncomfortable or the rejection or whatever it is, if we can find a story outside of ourselves, our brain's like, good job. Way to go. That's why like venting about somebody feels so good in the moment, because we're actually getting a reward from it within ourselves. Because it's like, great, you've made sense of it. And the other great news is you don't have to change a damn thing about yourself. The real disadvantage is we recreate patterns our lives that block us, hold us back, keep us in a permanent state of victimhood, or we constantly relive in one way or the other these experiences that we don't want to experience anymore, but we recreate it in a constant, by the projection of our perception.
You recreate it and then simultaneously decide every time, unless you zoom out and create space between this narrative, that it is the circumstances of everyone else but you. That's how married we get to it. And it's interesting. I've talked about my kind of life mantra or philosophy many times before, that my biggest fear is living the same story twice, basically, or the same year twice. I always want to rewrite the story. When I'm entering a year, I don't want the year to conclude and be like, fuck, I'm in the same place. And it's one thing to look at that on a surface level. I could change my job. I could change my relationship. I could change my location. But really, the goal is to actually do that internally, because that means that you're continuing on this path of personal growth. And as we've talked about so much on this podcast, that journey shouldn't end. I think that the most fulfilling thing that you can do as a human being is to collect experiences and continue to reshape what that looks like for you. And it's interesting because we do have the ability to write our stories, but it's like, when did you put the pen down and decide that's it? Like, fixed mindset is such a common thing that plagues us as human beings, right? And it's like, the shift happens, and I guess at all different stages of our lives, where you put the pen down, because we're going old school and apparently not using the laptop to write. Actually, that would be accurate for me, as we all know. The journal.
I was going to say, both of us are writers through and through. Yeah.
But it's fascinating because it's like, do you know how much control you have if you have the pen in your hand? Would you want somebody else writing the story for you if you just have this one life and this one opportunity? And so what we're really kind of diving into today is reminding you, as scary as it may be, because sometimes it's a lot easier to be like, oh, well, they did it and they wrote it and this is why, and that's why I'm justified to feel how I am and stay right fucking here. But the minute that you have that back in your hand and you're in control, that is where you can start creating positive shifts for yourself, because that fixed mindset is going to serve no one. Or one thing that I really like that you highlighted in the intro there is that perhaps there's things that you've acquired or stories that you've married about yourself. And when we say stories, it's deciding, this is like such a surface level example, just for the sake of explaining it. But I never learned to swim. So how have I navigated most of my adult life? I can't swim. I don't swim. I can't swim. I'll drown. Maybe I'll last 5 minutes with a tread of water and that's it. Well, what would happen if I decided, oh, I never learned to swim? I'm really open to it, though. That's one shift of the brain. I'm open to that new experience. Maybe haven't taken the action step yet, but there's a state of openness there. And then what if I go, I booked a lesson. I'm now learning to swim.
Yeah.
And then the next
I'm a swimmer that doesn't have the skill yet. I'm a swimmer that doesn't have the skills to swim. Like even that, where you've already decided, where you're like, no, I am that thing. I'm just lacking these components at the moment.
Exactly. And then eventually, if you continue on that path, that is now something you've acquired as your identity. Now, on the flip side of that, you may have collected personal traits that you've identified. That's my identity and who I am. And those have served a purpose for you. For myself, a really deeper example would be vulnerability. We've talked a lot on the podcast about I was someone, I don't cry and I don't share feelings. And as I've learned in therapy and my dabbles here and there, because I do have big lulls between sessions, some of that financial and some of that, I don't find the process fun. And it takes me time in between to work on what's come up. But the vulnerability aspect was very beneficial for me. I have learned, the example that I've been given, like the child moving through the jungle with her machete. And she had to cut through to build this resilience and be like, I got it, guys. I'm going to protect us. And that served me very, very well. But getting into midlife, it's realizing I'm chomping through these jungles, girl's tired and sweaty in this jungle. And it's deciding, like, when is she going to put it down and rest and allow herself to perhaps be carried, get a piggyback ride through a little section of it, allow people to hold space.
Or letting people be like, I'll grab the machete. Let me go first for a little bit.
Let me lead the way.
You know?
And so
yeah.
It was that deciding I can either double down and say, I'm not going to be this person. I'm not going to let people in. I'm view that as a weakness and that's who I am. And therefore I am strong. But are you? Because then life lessons are going to come into play where all of a sudden you can feel this misalignment where you're like, this skill set that I've had is actually working against me, not for me. And I think it's important when we talk about our personal narratives and these identities that we create ourselves to address not just acquiring for the sake of personal growth, but also letting go of stories that we have told ourselves time and time again that simply are not working. So that's kind of like I get the swim example very surface, but the vulnerability is like this internal journey that you realize certain qualities that, again, you needed that to get through. But at what point do you start learning the same lessons over and over again that you realize I could actually write this differently? What happens if I try? And more than likely, if you start to say, now I'm somebody that's like, I will gladly share space and share feelings and cry in public and all of that. And it's been incredibly enriching from a life perspective and terribly uncomfortable because, as you highlighted in your intro there, Laurie, well, oftentimes it doesn't happen because it means change. And we don't like change. I mean, we do. But generally, as human beings, we're like, oh God, no, I'm comfortable here. I might not be happy and I may be a touch miserable, but my God, it's comfortable.
You said something in we don't like change, but we do. But you and I actually don't like the feeling that everybody as a human being will feel in change, no more than the average person. What the difference is that there's enough evidence that we've accumulated why it's worth it and how it's changed our lives on the other side of that discomfort.
Fair.
Because that's one of the reasons I ran so hard and fast from it prior. That's one of the reasons I would dip so deeply into depression, because that change was coming and I would wait till the weight of it was so intense. So I would have that intense emotional experience versus just continually working at it and allowing that change to happen within me, because I was always very introspective, but then I didn't want to do the things around the things that I recognized I needed to be accountable for. Because I would be like, oh, that looks like a lot of work. Shut that door, blame that guy instead, Right. But it's that our brains want us to stay safe. And if we have to excavate feelings that come along with accountability, which can be feelings of guilt, which can be feelings of, like frustration or anything, or we don't know the road that does look like because we're used to this road. We're used to seeing things this way. And so if we change that line of thinking, what comes with it is a lot of this discomfort and worry in a way too, like, because our brains are going, I don't know that direction. I don't even know where to begin. Or it looks at it as like, man, you fucked it up again. When you suddenly see yourself going down that route again of blame, you're like, oh, you're doing that thing. And now I'm like guilt because I'm doing the thing that instead of all the things. And so it's recognizing right off the bat that, like, when we start to make those adjustments and start to recognize and be like, where do I have accountability here? Let me just pause. Okay, I'm going to finish that thought because I notice when I listen back, I interrupt a lot of my thoughts and jump to a next thought. So I'm going to finish this thought and then go. But it's that knowing ahead of time that your brain is doing what it's neurologically wired to do, which is to keep you safe. But like we're always saying, is like, what's on the other side of safety and that discomfort of going into the unknown is actually your growth, is actually your wellness. And because that safety thing is really for tigers. It's not for, going after the thing that you've always wanted to do, but you're afraid of rejection. You've got to go through the vulnerability and grab the courage to be. And that's part of it too, is the vulnerability of being like, I'm going to look at the things that make me feel not so great. So I interrupt this familiarity, this pattern that's creating this projection of a world that's not working for me. It is not working for me. And you cannot expect the outside world to adapt and to change so that you feel, or that suddenly your world is working for you. That will never happen. And that's why we continually feel more, and you see people get more and more bitter or more victimized in their life with age, because they keep doubling down, because their world gets smaller. They like less people, because more and more people disappoint, more and more people piss them off, all those different things. And so know that it is uncomfortable because your brain is trying to keep you safe, but you are I can't say the word, but
I love it.
Hear what I'm saying, right? And I've lost the other thought that I was going to hop to, and hopefully
it's funny when you said that, because I keep a notepad next to me as we go, because sometimes you're sharing these brilliant things and I'm actively listening, but then I have an aha moment like, oh, I want to circle back to that. And when you did that, I almost said, would you like me to I've got my pen, let me write our story.
Yeah, let's rewrite. But then I would have came back and like, oh no, I forgot the original thought. Would have to play it back to cue my brain and stuff. But just to I was hoping I'd have that second one, but really, really just did of recognizing, oh, I know what it was, is that, it is.
Nailed.
Is you said earlier about, I can't remember how you said it, but just before I was speaking, you had said something in regards to you just have to change essentially the lens, look at it differently. And there's even a little bit of a step that I actually do this with Joy in a Home in its own right with parents, is sometimes I always think of it like a treadmill, like the momentum is going in the one direction. And if you were to stop and try and run in the opposite direction while the momentum's going in one way on a treadmill, you just careen off into the abyss, or you'd be like, no,
that'd be funny.
yeah, try it. And so it's let's bring that treadmill down to the neutral state first. And one of the biggest things that was for myself and that I learned, and that really does work, is not necessarily trying to interrupt the momentum in the moment, because that's almost too hard to do, especially when first really looking at this all, is getting curious enough to being I'm really going at a pace here on this. I really feel this runaway thing. I'm really fixating on this person or this situation or this experience. There's got to be something here if I'm putting this much momentum into something. And then it's kind of recognizing first and foremost that I'm doing this. I'm pushing this momentum. It doesn't mean that the situation isn't happening and that it's not very real and that you shouldn't have an emotional feeling about it. But what is my story that I'm telling myself about this that is creating more momentum, more speed, and that is quite literally probably creating a bunch of side stories. And, now I've got chapters. Now it's not just and now my feeling, my original, trilogies are coming out. Now it's not just my original fair feeling. I am actually having a visceral reaction and response where I'm creating more and more energy behind that feeling. And the story gets bigger and deeper. And then it's not as real as it originally was. Now, and that's where we talk about that perception being projection, because it's one of those things. Yes, it happens, but my perception and my storyline is going to be that train leaving the station, is going to be that momentum and the speed clicking up on that treadmill. So how do I slow that down? It doesn't necessarily mean the train's not going to leave the station right off the bat, or that the Treadmill's not going to be going in this direction at the very beginning, especially. It takes a ton of work and a ton of practice. I'm not there yet. I've just like got my treadmill down to a slow saunter, but I'm still headed in the direction where my immediate thing is like that person, that thing. But one of my biggest cues is like, if I'm venting about the person, I might not be able to slow it down in that moment because there's too much momentum a little bit going. But my immediate thing is like, you, Laurie, you sit your ass down and you look at that shit. You look at that and like, what story are you telling yourself about it? And I'll save the thing for motivation way later. But like, it doesn't have to be all or nothing because it won't be. Part of it is like the curiosity first in and around it, and recognizing that you guaranteed, not if, what story about this am I telling myself, and how is it actually serving me? Because you can blame someone all day and they might but here's the other thing. Blame is where you get the like release and the gratification, because that means it's all them. But when you pull back and you're like, what story am I telling myself? And yes, what they did isn't okay with me. Well, then that's accountability on my part and their part. And that means a conversation or a boundary. That still is on you. But you have a part in it. No matter which way you spin it, you have a big part of it. And it's exceptionally empowering, but it's challenging because now I have to look at, well, where did this story originate from? When did I start this dialogue about this type of situation or about this kind of person? And a lot of times, if not all the time, it goes back to childhood experiences when you had to first protect yourself. It's essentially interrupted emotions where we felt like we weren't safe in some emotional space or time or an event that happened. And the meaning that we gave it, especially as kids, I'm not safe. I need to protect myself in this way. And then off with the races. You got a whole lifetime of that. And if you've never had that experience where, you had adults in your life guiding you or role modeling how to recognize first, are you safe? What happened there? Okay, well, what story are you telling yourself? Well, where's your accountability? What are you going to do next? And that never really happened.
In the 90s, nobody was doing that level of self-work at that point in time. We were fucked.
Yeah. So we're
therapy was bad, and God forbid you had a mental health issue.
Oh God, you'd be in the hospital immediately. Like, right? Pill them up. Well, that's like, actually still what's happening.
That. Shove them in.
Yeah.
Or take this prescription. One of the points that I think, as you were sharing there, when you're talking about recognizing and taking the accountability within ourselves, that word compassion, and compassion for yourself, compassion and empathy for yourself. This is something that I have had to work on so greatly, and I'm still really bad at it. Not so much the accountability part, because I will say I'm somebody that tries really hard. And again, this is all happening through my own lived experience. But when things are happening, I really work to try. And I know it's such an old saying, but put yourself in their shoes. And I really try to gain more perspectives by having that mental exercise. But regardless, when you're taking accountability, and especially if it's a story you've had about yourself for a really long time, you may see things within yourself that don't feel good, especially if it's not qualities you would have actually identified or had an awareness that you were identifying with.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you pull that cover off and really have an aha moment, at that point, you cannot unsee it. I mean, for myself, it was anger that I had that I didn't realize I had, anger and resentment. And I started to really look at how that's come up in my life. And you can't not look at that without then having to take accountability and look at how that impacted other people. And for myself, the more, and we know I struggle with memory. So then it's like, as you go down this rabbit hole, you're unlocking memories. And there's ways I've showed up with people that I love in my life that are in my life today. And there's others that were simply part of my story that I'm not connected with, but I know that's what their experience was with me. And again, from my lens, but I know how I behaved and acted. And it doesn't feel good, especially when you're like, I'm not that person. And I told myself I was not that person because that protected me. If I didn't look at that, I didn't have to feel that I caused that for another human being.
Yeah.
And that's where I say the compassion is so important when you do this work, because at the end of the day, we know we're humans and rarely get it 100% right all of the time. And I don't say compassion in looking and being like, well, give myself a hug, like, oh, well, like you actually have to dive there and look and be, and,
Yeah.
but I know in myself, I've had very like this, when you use the word visceral, like very visceral reactions. Like even in therapy, they always pay attention to body language, depending on what model of therapy you're doing. And it's like, I can feel it. And I'm like, oh God, like that's gross. Like, I don't like that. But just celebrate that and pour compassion into that space. Because if you are looking at versions of yourself that have showed up, that were part of your identity that you didn't even realize you were bringing along, if it makes you feel that way, that gross little feeling, that means you're growing. You may not have grown out of it, because like the awareness is step one, but it means you have this yearning to grow, and there's something to be learned from that experience, and really pare it down of like, where did this come from, and why am I showing up this way, and what is it trying to tell me, and how would I like to identify going forward in these situations. Give yourself compassion, because that can give you the lens of opportunity from it, which is really where all the growth happens. But a lot of times when you start to do the work and look under the hood, you're going to see, because we want to look at ourselves like, I go through the world and I'm Snow White and the animals are coming and it's la, 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 la. But like at the end of the day, we aren't that. And as a result, there is some damage that happens in our path often. And it's even harder to take when you can look at it and you're like, oh, that actually impacted another human being or human beings in this not so great way. But just know we've all fucking been there. And to be honest, in my, like, I'm still going to do it to people. You know what I mean? Like, it's not intentionally, but like when you aren't doing the work and as you say, you're on the treadmill and you're going in a direction, it will happen. But like, having that awareness is everything, and just being able to be very kind to yourself when you do.
Yeah. You said that really uncomfortable, I don't even think is the right word. We said like visceral, but it's that like you can feel, it can actually like feel like a heartbreak almost when you start to zoom out and then really get curious about what your story is, how you've shown up, what your dialogue has been, and how that's affected other people. Gosh, like suddenly a memory completely changes. Because now that you're seeing things differently, a memory actually shifts and you see how very different it looks through a different lens. Quite literally, memories all of a sudden will shift and you're like, oh my God, that's why we say like reality is so not reality. And it's powerful, but it does come along with your very human feelings that are really tough. And I think one of the things to remember is the difference between guilt and shame. Like Krissy said, it's important that we feel that. And that is guilt. That's a really important emotion to feel, because that means that we're not a sociopath or a psychopath, because we actually feel remorse. But it's that not getting stuck in the guilt. It's using the guilt as information and as a momentum as to why it's important to also to show up differently and what that would look like, but not get it confused with shame. Shame is when we say identify with our choices and behavior. Shame says, I am a bad person because I did this. I am unkind, or I am a loser, or I am a failure. Whereas guilt says, I chose this and that didn't work. So it's that kind of like failing forward, or it's saying, I behave this way and that hurts somebody, or that this, and then that you can adjust accordingly. That's the difference. Fixed mindset isn't around shame. I am. Whereas growth is about behavior, is like, and that's where we have room to change. Because if I am that thing, how could you change if I am that thing? And that's where I say it's been such a revolutionary concept to really like understand is in my life and for many, and Krissy, you as well, is like, I am whatever I decide I am. I might have a challenge ahead of me in making the adjustments or making the changes. And because I have committed to doing the uncomfortable work and going to those deeper, darker spaces, or like feeling the discomfort, but then like not giving up and not going back, who I am as a 20-year-old to a 30-year-old is night and day. And I guarantee who I am as a 30-year-old to 40-year-old, like my value systems and my, in many ways, I'm still like, wily as hell. I'm still goofy and all the things, but I've chosen to keep those pieces a part of me. I also recognize where they're coping mechanisms, because I get quite uncomfortable in groups. You'd never know it. But because when I learned, I get oversensory. And so I learned as a young child, if you steer the energy and if you become the energy source, then you don't have to be, because also I'm very sensitive to other people's energies. And so if I become the energy source and have people plug into me, I don't have to plug into the other 10 people in the room. But what happened is that was super adaptive, and it still is super adaptive. But what happened is I went over, the line with it, where it was like, it became the Laurie show. And you're like, there's times in which that really works, and that's great still today. But there's also times where you're like, I have to be like, shut it down, close your mouth. Like I have to quite literally coach myself, because again, it's like a treadmill. And so there's certain aspects that I absolutely still keep, and I'm 100% myself. If anyone's met me, they're like, yeah, definitely full on. But that's who I am. But that's also because that's been a chosen part of who I am. But if at any point, if that became really maladaptive, you bet your ass I would like work my ass off to do the uncomfortable work, to be the quiet, reserved person. But that's not who I want to be. But everything about our personalities was adapted. Yes, there's absolutely, I believe, who you kind of come into this world as, like a bit of like the expression of your soul and spirit. But after that, everything becomes adaptive. Everything becomes adaptive. And your personal personality, which is your personal reality, which we spoke to, is fundamentally built off of all these little small intricate social cues that says, yes, do more of that. No, do less of that. This is what'll keep you safe. And so it's really going and looking at it and be like, you're none of those things. So shame locks you in who you think you are, but in a negative space, where it's like, you look at it as like, filter it always down to how I feel and my behavior. And is that serve me? And does that not? And if it serves you in the moment, but not in the bigger picture, then it doesn't serve you.
When it comes to doing this work, I think it's really like, I'm glad that you were saying there that what serves you as a negative or positive, because I know a lot of times our conversations, we're talking about a lot of the aspects that weren't working for us. But I think that's because you're all here because you generally are invested in personal growth. And generally that's what the process is looking at what's not working, but really driving home that there is this, it's a powerful tool for a positive if you get a handle on this.
Yeah.
Because that does put you in the driver's seat of what am I going to choose in this situation? And where am I going to actively take a role in this situation? And giving yourself space between actual situations and what you are telling yourself. Like, you have to drive that distance. And, I know we talk about meditation on this podcast all the time. And I think one of the most profound things was, because it was not a practice that I ever did. I actually had told myself a story. I don't meditate. I'm not good at it for a very long time.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm supposed to put this tape on and then there is going to be silence. And this guy that I was sitting with, his name was Julian. And he's like, so you haven't given your brain any opportunity to speak, and you decided that you were going to allow it and you were surprised that 5 million voices tried to talk to you at once. It's like, right. Never thought of it that way. And then it was like understanding that creating of distance. And although I'm not talking specifically about meditation in this capacity right now, but I think you can use those same principles of like, how can I create distance for myself between the stories that are wanting to run, especially if they are practice stories that you've married in your brain, often stemming back to these childhood experiences. It's very difficult, as we've highlighted, to break some of these grooves if you've been practicing them for decades. And everything in your mind is going to try to kind of keep you anchored into the place of that comfort, even though it's misery. It's going to do everything it can to keep you there. And as Laurie highlighted, the why behind that, it's like, thank you, built-in brain. There is no lie in there. But if you don't take the time to create the space, not only are you going to stay in mindsets that aren't serving you, but talk about perspective reframe. And maybe this is what you need to hear. You are robbing yourself of your own power to create a story that serves you and could take you to the places that you probably dream about in your brain. You are robbing yourself from that point blank. And I think everyone in their lives actually has to do frequent audits of that, because every time we do move through a difficult change, I mean, how many times I feel like growth mindset, and you see those diagrams on Instagram, sometimes there's a common quote and it's just like a big scribble and up and a down. And it's like, and then I got to the peak and then I fell down again. And that's exactly what it is. You don't get through it and then stay there. But if you keep reminding yourself, like, this is my power, this is my opportunity, this is my life, this is my fucking life. How do I want to live that? How do I want to show up in this world? How do I want to make people feel? How do I want to show up for myself? Like, that is by far the biggest one. How do I want to give myself love? How do I want to speak to myself? Really, if we're all connected, which I truly know that we are.
I was like, it's
where
not even
the work needs to start.
Yeah.
Instead of that, like, extrinsic, because it all bleeds through. But I'm like, that is your power and really your responsibility. And it is a responsibility, because otherwise you're going to just loop into this fixed thing. And exactly as Laurie said, it's why you see certain behaviors as people age, because they're so fucking married to it. And it's just so goddamn easy in their minds to say it's that person's fault and they're the reason why. And this is why my life was shitty, or this is why this happened. What a powerless statement to make. Like, sorry, it's not how it fucking works. There are certainly things that happen, and like, we acknowledge all the time, because of where we live and because of the families we grew up with. There were definitely like privileges and things that we have in our lives that, you know, we're very lucky to have. But when it comes to like the deep down nitty gritty being a human being type of fucking work, like, anyone can do that.
Yeah. The other thing, when we talk about it being empowering, it's not just because you also are like, gosh, I got so much choice and I can, like Krissy said, it's so very true. Like, you get to move towards a life that you really want for yourself or have dreamt for yourself. And it's the absolute truth. Like, I'm saying this from experience, things that I only could like hope I would feel one day, not have. Let me be very clear. The have are the bonuses, because those come along with, but the way I feel about my life is so very different. Not just because I have just a more expansive outlook on this planet and my experience on it and all those things. I live a completely different reality than I did as a 20-year-old and a 15-year-old. I didn't want to be on this earth. I was desperate to not. I was always wishing and hoping and praying for something to come take me soon. I have a different reality. I have a different perspective. I have a different experience fully in this life. I had to work really hard to get there. And I for a long time, I was just making the best of the reality that I had. But when I recognized I could literally change my reality, my full-blown experience of this life, and I feel like a different human in many ways. I'm the same human, but a very different human being. And I always think, my God, if I could do it, you just have to be stubborn enough to not give up. That's the only trick I had in my belt. that I was just stubborn enough that I was like, well, if I got to live this life, I might as well find out if there's another way of doing it. And then when I would follow the breadcrumbs, and I was just stubborn enough to be like, well, I'm already miserable, so I might as well just be miserable working towards something.
Yeah.
Like, and so that, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm not miserable. I'm quite really like, I just have a wellness and a calmness, and then it built and built. So like the empowerment isn't just in the creating the life that you want for yourself. The empowerment is like a day-to-day basis of like having more energy, having more clarity, your improvement of relationships, the changing of dynamics, the like all the things. And it's a slow burn. It's a, practicing every day in one way or the other, but it is life changing. And when you really get going on it and you really dig in and just make that commitment, I don't care how long it takes. Well, good news, bad news, it takes a lifetime. But I mean, till you have the real evidence, it's just like, no, do not quit. Do not stop looking at it. Do not stop like tweaking and revisiting and staying with the discussion. Like, do not stop. Like, that's why I say I wanted to get this as clear as possible at the beginning. Whether or not I did that, God only knows. But it's one of those things where it has been the biggest, I'd say, piece of the puzzle that ripple effect into everything else that we talk about here. Is like, what story are you telling yourself? Because it is the reality in which you're living, and it is the projection in which you see yourself, the world around you, and the people involved as well.
There's only one thing for me to do after that incredible statement.
Motivation maintenance. We made it like a church gospel.
We did.
We made it like
Hallelujah. Yeah. I'm gonna let you go first because mine's short and obvious.
Okay, mine is get it out of your head and get it down. So when I have a story I'm telling myself, I write down the story. And I write it as much detail as I feel. They did this, and then I said, and I felt this way, and I did, kind of thing. You don't have to write it down with as much detail. I do. Then I scour it and I look at, and I pick the facts out, and I put the facts on one piece of paper, and I put my perspective on the other piece of paper. And it's usually the facts are quite minimal, but my story, it is a literary
wonder.
Feat wonder. And then I really can see in front of me how much of this is my perspective on it. And then I look at how much of it needs to be addressed, and how much of this likely is taking place of maybe how I felt that day, all those different things. If there's a real focus on how they made me feel, then I really focus on, when have I felt that way outside of this experience and this person? And when did this kind of like, when do I really remember? And almost always it's a feeling of insecurity. They've made me feel insecure in who I am. And then I recognize that it's like, is that something to actually address? Or is this just my insecurity being flared up in a really passing by way? So I really get it down, get it clear. What are the facts? What's my interpretation? And then like, where else have I felt this? So how much of this is my pattern essentially? And is it serving me? And also looking at like, how did I react and respond? Is that the most appropriate? Did that actually serve the situation, or was that the most generous way? And this actually just happened a week ago. I was around people that are new people to me. I've only been around a couple times, and like, they're pretty reserved. And this was like at a supper, and really, really nice people, just reserved, just a more reserved couple. And the whole dynamic felt, so everyone was quite reserved, and it definitely didn't feel like a get real silly environment. And if I'm with people, I won't be silly for the most part, unless we're in a serious setting, like unless it calls for seriousness. But if it doesn't, and we're getting together as like people and friends, I want us to just fully be ourselves, right? That's not going to happen always. But what I started to
Most
do
people are holding
was,
on for dear life to not be themselves at all. That's an uphill battle.
right. And what happened though is rather than recognizing that like, hey, it's just that's either not who they are or it's not their comfort space around new people. What I did is I wanted to reject them. Like every inside of me was just like, why can't you let yourself be da 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 da? And I felt this like negativity towards them, annoyance almost, because I am used to being around people now that are fully just let themselves be themselves regardless of the environment. Obviously in an appropriate way, but still just fully
Not
themselves.
always. Not always.
Feral
bunch.
We are a feral bunch. So I found this like real judgmental version of myself coming out, and I recognized it and flagged it. I couldn't stop the judgment from coming through. But I was like, once I was quiet on my own, I was like, what was that? That's come up a couple times now, like, or not a couple times, a lot of times. But now that I'm recognizing it as such, and it was like, those were the kind of people that I used to feel very judged by. None of that was happening in that scenario, but they're the personality types that used to judge me. So my protectiveness way back when was like, if I can judge you first, then your judgment can't, I'll repel it, right? With my judgments versus just being like, and sometimes I am just like, it doesn't matter here nor there. I'm just going to fully be me. But I think when there's an environment where I genuinely don't feel like I can be me without it looking like a real sore thumb, like even just my slight volume turned up would have looked like I cranked the volume on myself just by like, a dial up. I immediately went to that space. So I had to do some exercises and getting it on paper, recognizing what was fact, and then just like, so I re-envisioned, this is maybe a little second part, but I re-envisioned afterwards that same interaction, but me just feeling warmth towards them. And me just like sending of like, if this is truly who you are, good on you. But if you want to be more than this, then like know that I hope you can fully be yourself no matter the situation, kind of thing. And so like we talked about hanging pictures on the wall for the first half an hour. And I was like, I don't know if this is my jam right now, but like good people, like great people, but just everyone was staying in their box. Of where do you like to hang a photo? Oh, I like to hang. And I was just like, and I was participating because I was like, yeah, I don't like crooked photos. But again, so get the story down. What's fact? What's your feelings? Where does this originate? And then if you want to take it a little step forward, recreate that same situation, but have yourself visualize showing up in a different space and way.
Just be prepared. Our next episode will be Photo Hanging 101 with Laurie Joy.
Just
got all the tips.
Got some tips.
So I said mine's going to be really short and obvious, but with good reason and good reminder that especially if you're going back, which as we talked, a lot of these behaviors mean you got to reverse, and you might be reversing way back into that childhood land. And I mean, honestly, I don't even think it depends on your lived experience. That can be really hard work. And also, as Laurie and we can do a whole episode on this about like memories and how we record, and the fact exactly that it's not fact. They're just your memories that are made up of whatever reality and perception you had at that point in time. But my point of that is that when you go in there, you may need support to move through it. And also it can be really beneficial to have just like an objective guide to help you get there. Because if you've never really explored in that way, it feels really foreign. And I know that we live in this amazing time that there's so much information and we could learn through reading, but like, I think there's so much benefit having that guide. And, for me, what that looked like is starting a counseling journey and therapy. And I think if you actually are really looking at taking this work seriously and you have the means, 100%, that would be where I start. or where I would recommend you start. And highlighting as well, I get it. Counseling's very expensive. It's very worth it. A lot of people operate with sliding scales. So if you're someone that's like, that's not an option that's available to me, it does take a little bit more time and research, but more than likely, wherever you live, there's some flexibility there with a lot of practitioners. And if not that, I mean, I know not everyone's gifted with a Laurie, but like a trusted confidant or trusted friend, like that can kind of hold space sometimes. Like I get, obviously, a lot of this work is internal and on your own, but as I say, just doing that back work, because kind of how we talked about in this whole episode, and I know I said this is going to be a quick point, but as I say it, my thought brain is going where I'm like, you have to remember what I said earlier, that your brain is going to do everything it can to not look at it because it's not comfortable. And so if you're only doing this journey solo, you actually might miss a lot of the points or a lot of the work along the way because you're trying to solve it faster, easier, and not feel it. Whereas if you do have someone like a counselor, they're really able to take you through the process, and it is a process. So that would be my number one. If you've listened to this and you're like, yeah, I'm curious. Yes, I am someone that feels ready to start dipping my toes. Highly recommend. Give it a shot. If you've never done therapy, I end every session. My therapist goes, so how was it this time? And I'm like, you're still lovely and I still hate it. And then we have a laugh every time because I'm like, you're a great human being.
Yeah.
Like, I hate all of this. And she doesn't take offense because it's a really normal thing. So I'm like,
Yeah.
if you're somebody, especially that has denied a lot of the vulnerable parts of yourselves, it's not going to necessarily be enjoyable, but it will be at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really wonderful and important, is just that of like having a support system helping you navigate too in pieces of it, or big chunks of it. And just a little side note of like, whoever you choose, if you do choose the friend or friends, be very clear on the type that you are going to utilize this. Don't choose the friends that are going to jump on your bandwagon and just agree with whatever it is that you're saying and feeling, because they actually, not with the intention, but what ends up happening is they help you double down on your victimhood, or they help you double down. Yeah. And so they'll be like, yeah, I think you're right. They're the worst. Like, because it's that you want them to look at it objectively. You want them to be the one that's looking on the outside, looking in, knowing you, having the same intentions as you. Like, and even saying like, this is my goal. I want you to help me in, I say this saying wrong. Dave's overheard me say it. So hopefully I say it right this time. To see the trees through the forest. Is that how you say it? I say it opposite. Forest through the trees.
Probably. You know what's funny? It's not a thing I use very often, but I think forest for the trees, because you'd see the trees in the forest.
Just think of the metaphor and you'll know what I mean by that.
Yeah, and then
but it is
lead.
See the birds through the trees and the forest through the trees. But it's like really having somebody that is going to help you see the clarity, and also help interrupt if you start to go down a shame spiral. It's to like, whoa, let's, so it's that little bit of like, it's like, I think of it as a bowling alley, and they're the little bumpers on the side. So it's like, you can bounce that, but you're still headed towards the pins, not going too much in the gutter there. You'll have a little bit of a bumpy ride.
The analogy that my current business partner uses in whatever the heck journey I'm on in that world.
Yeah. So it's that like, funny. So I think that's really, really important. I utilize a few different people, Krissy, you being very much one of them. And
so she's screwed.
I'm screwed.
She's screwed.
So that's why I believe everybody's the worst and I am the best. Krissy's told me this.
Trained up
right. Like, she's like, fuck them. Fuck them.
Quotes. I'm going to give you quotes and context of why I picked this one. Marianne Williamson quote, "The past doesn't determine your future unless you carry it with you to the present. Forgiving yourself and others, you free the universe to begin again at any moment." And I just want to clarify that, and I chose this only because when we talk about a lot of this work, it's just, and I've been guilty of this too, people just get so married to this was my past experience, so this is why I am the way I am, like that fixed mindset where it's the blame game and all of that.
Yes.
And to a degree, your past absolutely influences who you are as a human being. I mean, we spent this whole podcast talking about if you have these kind of
plays
feelings and reactions,
the
you gotta reverse
monumental
everything.
Yeah.
But when we talk about perspective shift in that quote, I'm like, here's the thing. It can either fix you there or it can fuel you forward. And so doing this work is going to help you figure out the way to best utilize it to fuel you forward.
Absolutely. Because the past, what happened, just to piggyback a little bit before we hop off, the past that happened was the events. It was the meaning that your younger self gave it that created all the dislodged or the oppressed emotions in your nervous system and the way you think and the condition, all those different things. And that's why the past is important, because you can understand where you're starting from. But that's information. Now it is your job and your accountability to the meaning that you're going to give it that empowers you moving forward. It's not what happened to you. It's the meaning that you're going to give it and the information you're going to take from it to create a new. It is your job as the human being to do what you can, where you can, with whatever you have resourcefulness to even just get find the crack of resources that you have, or the time that you have, the space that you have, the capacity that you have to look at it, take the information, and then what micro step are you going to use to move forward? And then. And that's where your brain changes, your perception changes, your nervous system changes, and then your momentum continues to grow from there. And so it's not we're saying or taking away of everything. You and I both have our own stuff, our own, that we're working through. But it's that just remember, you could, if you're hearing it going well, that's nice to say, but does that story that you're using work for you? If not, then stop making excuses and then try something different. So that's the thing. If you want to argue with me, that's fine, but you're not actually arguing with me or Krissy. You're arguing with your story. You're defending your story and your story is the one that's actually speaking up, being don't listen to them. We're fine just where we are.
Yes.
Don't listen to them. And that's where you're if you're listening, it's because you want change. It's because you're fueled by this. So I'm just if there's a part of you that's arguing, that's actually really good, because that's the part of your old conditioning, desperate to hold on to what feels safe, which is everything that you've known. But if you're honest, I guarantee you're it hasn't really worked for me so far. Right? And then you're okay, well, great. That's actually really good news, because that means that there can be different. Anyways, definitely. I'm going to start preaching I'm on a bloody... I just get so hyped up about this shit.
I did love it. Game changer. I'm piggyback off of that. But how I talked about vulnerability. Here we go. This is going to be the 5-hour-long podcast. Welcome. But with you saying that, just how I opened up, how vulnerability was a big one for me for a long time. The story I told myself was I got it figured out. What's with these people that can't hold it together? I am tough. I am strong. There was a lot of judgment there if I looked around. And exactly that. If I was listening in that mindset to something like this, I would still have held down and be oh, that's unfortunate for them. They don't have it all figured out. I'm strong. I am this. I will push through it, because it was everything in me to be we're not going to open that to go deeper and figure it out. And it was robbing me of a lot more than I even realized. So I'm if you are that person, I sympathize with you, because I was so attached to that story of I got it. I don't need it. I don't need to move through it. And your brain will do that. And mine did so very defiantly in a lot of ways that
me too. I would have been the one arguing and be you don't know this relationship and you don't know what happened. I would have been the one that's that. I get that idea, but they don't know. I hear, it's funny. You and I are the opposite spectrum. You were oh, I don't know what that would be to victimize self in that way, where I did. I was very much, even though I was very much I'm going to go do my own thing. And I'm going to I was always pushing, and I was always very much of go-getter on whatever it is I wanted. but it was almost out of like defiance of being a victim. I'll show them.
Totally.
And you're like,
Toxic
again,
positivity.
yeah, where it was like, again, adaptive. And then I got maladaptive when I was like, well, you're victimizing yourself over some pretty silly, stupid things. And, but anyways, we're going to let you go because it's about that time. We love you all. Go get it. Change your story. Change your life. Because that is your motivation.
You've just listened to the Motovation Podcast with your host, Krissy Vann, and me, Laurie Joy Kingwell.
Thanks for joining us along the ride. We've got new episodes dropping every Monday, and we're all about community. So follow us on Instagram at Motovation Podcast and visit our website at themotovation.com.
And in the meantime, tanks full and full throttle.